Well, good morning. So we have been walking through the book of Proverbs. And you've heard me say, you've heard Pastor Charlie say that Proverbs is it's kind of a unique book because it's not set up. There are some of you, right? When I was a kid, when I was really little, I got diagnosed with what was then called ADD. They didn't even have the H yet. We were running around too much, and they couldn't pin the H to us yet. But there are some of you who have that diagnosis, or you think maybe I have that diagnosis, or you're just messy and you use that justification as a diagnosis, whatever, no shade, you're loved. But Proverbs can feel a little bit like you've asked someone with ADHD to be your librarian. There's just stuff all over the place, and it's moving around. And the reason it feels that way is because Proverbs is written with, in my mind, the easiest way to think about it is like you're recording a series of walks that you take with somebody. And you're just seeing different things, and you're experiencing different things, and you're noticing different things. And so sometimes you see the same thing over and over again. When I go for jogs in the morning, I see rabbits all the time, and I don't catalog them and have like a journal entry for all the rabbits I've seen over the last 6 months. But I do note sometimes, man, I saw a lot of rabbits today. And Proverbs just kind of wanders around, and so we've tried to pull these things together and look at them in a little bit more organized way than maybe Proverbs gives us. I'm just turning off my. Your phones automatically turn off and lock in 30 seconds. I'm just fixing that for us. But Proverbs, it moves around all these different subjects. So we spent several weeks looking at kind of these big theological topics, things like wisdom, things like money. We talked about a bunch of those things. And then we took our time to look at different relationships. We looked at marriage, we looked at family, we talked about neighbors. This week, we are talking about a relationship that we don't have, which feels kind of funny. We're talking about how we relate to strangers. How do we relate to strangers? Now, a couple of years ago, there was he's kind of one of these popular authors who's both, he does some science writing and history and all these things, a guy named Jared Diamond. And he got his start studying birds in Papua New Guinea, which is an island in the South Pacific. And one of the things that he noticed and kind of began studying about history and archaeology and all these other things was that in Papua New Guinea, it was 1930 when large parts of that country were actually first kind of opened up to Westerners, meaning that there were whole big chunks of the island, of the country, because of the fact that it was an island, because that inside of the island it was very mountainous and hard to get to. There were pockets of people that lived very, very, very differently than people all around them did. And so all the cultural interactions, and so what he kind of realized was that this area in Papua New Guinea was almost like a time capsule of the way that people had interacted and lived and engaged with each other a very long time ago, a time much closer to Proverbs than to our times. And so he writes this really helpful book that kind of unpacks some of these things. But he starts by talking about an airport. And he kind of describes this scene where he's in an airport, and there are people coming and going. There are multiple languages being spoken. There are flights coming from one continent headed to another continent. People are moving in and out, people that will never see each other again, that have never maybe even stepped in the same country before. All of a sudden they're passing, and before they can even introduce themselves to each other, they've got a plane to catch. And he draws that out to kind of say how weird our modern world is, that we bump into strangers all of the time. In fact, if you tried to stop and introduce yourself to every single person that you don't know in the course of a day, you probably wouldn't do anything other than just introduce yourself to person after person after person. And so that's a very different world than an ancient way of living, where people did not have planes and trains and automobiles, where they stayed put, where if somebody grew up in a certain valley, it might be that they lived in that valley their entire life. And so strangers in the Bible is very different than strangers in our world today. And yet, there are lots of similarities. In the ancient world, people would try to figure out, maybe we're actually not strangers. Maybe we know each other in some surprising way that none of us really expected. And so they would look for language connections. They would look for tribal connections. They would look for religious connections. People do the same thing today. If you're in a new place and you find out that somebody is a fan of the same sports team as you, or you look at somebody's bumper sticker and you say, oh, look, they vacation in the same places that we vacation. When we were first candidating here, I remember I was chatting with someone. I don't remember who it was, so there's no judgment here in this. And they said, where are you from? And I said, I'm from New York. And they said, oh, New York. They didn't say it out loud, but they kind of gave me one of those faces. And I said, yeah, I'm from New York. And I could and I was like, but my wife, she was born in Delaware and grew up in Kennett Square. I said, oh, okay. And immediately, they opened up a little bit more. That there's this really funny thing that we recognize that we're often surrounded by strangers. Maybe even in this room, there are people that you don't know. We all have name tags on now at this point, or most of us do, so there's very little excuse, but there's just this kind of Western, modern, cultural idea that there are lots of people that are strangers. We don't know our neighbors. They're basically strangers too. Maybe we don't even know our cousins or our aunts or our uncles. Maybe they're strangers too. And we just kind of live in this way where we're okay with strangers. Which could be okay if we really were focused on what the Bible has to say about strangers. And so we're going to try to do that this morning. We're going to try to understand what Proverbs says about strangers, and then what's said about strangers before Proverbs and what's said about strangers after Proverbs. Now, in the Bible, now I don't do this a lot, but in the Bible, there are, the Bible is written, or I'll introduce you to the fact that the Bible is written in other languages. And the Old Testament Bible was written in Hebrew. Now, I am terrible at Hebrew. I think Pastor Charlie maybe does a better job at Hebrew. But there are really two types of strangers that are talked about in the Old Testament. And they use different words. Now, hopefully these come up. Let's see if they look like anything. They do. There they are. Now, everybody knows they're Hebrew up here, so we're good. I will move on. There are two names, two descriptions of two categories of stranger that are given in the Bible, most popular. There's some other ones that are kind of on the edge, but these are overwhelmingly, 90% of the time that somebody talks about a stranger in the Bible, they're going to use one of these two words: Zar and Ger. Zar and Ger. And they have two shockingly different descriptions, and they come up in two shockingly different ways. And so we're going to have to slowly walk through and understand what both of these mean if we want to faithfully understand what the Bible has to say to us, people who live around strangers all the time, about what God sees and thinks about strangers. Now, this word zar is actually the word that is overwhelmingly used in the book of Proverbs. And I want to give you a warning. This word zar is actually used in a way to warn people. It's seen as we might call it a stranger danger. And the two ways that it comes up most often are in economic discussions and discussions around adultery and prostitution and intimacy. This word czar shows up in both of those categories. So, for instance, in 4 times, kind of back to back to back, the author of Proverbs warns about this idea of putting up security for a stranger. Proverbs 11:15, whoever puts up security for a stranger will surely suffer, but whoever refuses to shake the hand in pledge is safe. There's this kind of idea, this warning that don't get entangled, that there is a danger that is there. I'm going to just keep going, sorry. But then it keeps going, and it says a little bit differently. So there it says, whoever puts up security for a stranger will surely suffer. But then it says this, take the garment of one who has put up security for a stranger, hold it in pledge if it is done for an outsider. Now, okay, you've got those two, and what does that mean? Well, here's something that's really interesting. In the Bible, several times, God says, one, you shouldn't loan people money, your people money, and you shouldn't hold someone's garment, that it is not a kind thing to do. But there's this one carve-out about loans in Deuteronomy that says it is okay for you to lend to people who are foreigners, who are moving through. And you say, well, why? What is that there is this idea that it is permissible, and we'll talk about in a second kind of exactly why, but here in Proverbs it says, but it is not wise. Do you see that? Because Proverbs is not trying to say everything that can be said. It's adding to the law that God has already given his people. And so we're earlier in the law. The law says it is permissible to loan strangers money at interest. Here in Proverbs, the author says it's permissible, but it's actually not wise to get engaged and to invest in people that you don't know. And I think what it's trying to say is that people who are not rooted in a place can move on. That's just a part of what's happening. That there is a transientness, and so you don't know what's going to happen, which is, I think, why that idea of the loan is carved out. They say that they don't have a home here. They're not rooted. You can't knock on their door. You don't know their address. And so there is a risk, and so you are allowed to lend money in a certain way, but it's different. But when you get to Proverbs, the author of Proverbs says, just don't do it. Just trust me. It's better if you don't do it. It is permissible, but it's not good. Anybody loan somebody their jacket recently as collateral? That feels very weird. Okay, so what is actually going on? Well, if you were trying to do a quick deal, and you didn't bring the money that you had for that deal, what you might do, your jacket would be worth something. Garments cost money, they took time, they were expensive. And so you could, in a pinch, imagine if all of a sudden somebody walked up to me and they said, I have an amazing deal for you, but you need to give me a deposit right now. And I said, that sounds too good to be true. Here is my wedding ring. You take my wedding ring as a deposit to guarantee that I'm invested in this thing. You would say, That's kind of what's going on, this idea of taking a garment. But in the Bible, people didn't have jewelry like this. And so God actually says, do not take the garment of someone who's poor because they need it at night. You can't hold someone's garments overnight, the Bible says. And so there's this real instruction and warning, but people sometimes would say, I'll give you my garment because I want to do a fast deal. And so there's this kind of idea that this kind of economic interaction was maybe shady, most likely unwise. Now, I bet that some of you have co-signed loans for people that you know. Maybe you're married and you are on a mortgage together. Maybe you own a business and you have business partners. Maybe you have a parent who co-signed for you on a loan. Maybe you're a parent who's co-signed for somebody else on a loan. Like, those are normal things. But imagine yourself, you're at the bank and you're waiting for a teller, and somebody walks up to you and they stand in line behind you and they tap you on the shoulder. And you say hi and good morning, and you just go to waiting, and they say, excuse me, can I just grab your... I have this loan that I need to get out for a new car, but I need somebody to co-sign for it. Would you be willing to co-sign for my loan this morning? You would just probably say, I'm sorry, I just can't do that, right? There's a wisdom in that. If you're a young person in here, and you're saying, I don't know what sounds wrong with that. Let me just tell you right now, there is a wisdom in not putting your reputation or putting your financial stake in somebody that you don't know. That's what the passage is saying. That's what the father is warning his son about. But then it also says, but if somebody has loaned you their garment because they're doing a fast deal somewhere else, it's okay for you to keep it. It's okay for you to hold somebody to account who likes jumping into fast, possibly unwise deals. And part of the reality is that the only place that you could do these fast, unwise deals are with outsiders, are with people who are kind of removed from the economic community. Did you know that even in medieval Europe, and this is weird, this is like really, really weird. I don't know what to do with this. If you ask me, like, as a pastor, what are a few of the things that I don't have a good answer for, I would tell you what the Bible says about interest. Because in the Old Testament, the Bible is totally against interest. And there's one carve-out for people who are foreigners. And so there was this weird thing that happened in medieval Western Christian Europe that Christians said, well, we're not supposed to loan to each other at interest. But they said, but Jewish people, they're not like us. They're foreigners, and therefore they can lend at interest. And there was this kind of weird carve-out which allowed for, well, if I can put my money over there and I can get better, like, it became very backwards and twisted. But there was this idea that if you keep somebody at arm's length, then it really doesn't matter, you don't know enough about them to feel bad about how you're exploiting them. That's kind of what seems to be going on in this passage. That kind of seems to be what's going on as the father warns his son, kind of 4 different ways about getting entangled in these economic things. But there's another way that this word czar is used. That other way that the word czar is used is when it comes to prostitution and adultery. So the same word talks about seeking wisdom. It says, they will keep you from the adulterous woman. That adulteress there is the same word, czar, strange. They will keep you from strange women, from wayward women, from her seductive words. So that there's this thing going on that Proverbs is warning on one hand about shady economic deals that seem too good to be true, that are done with people that you don't know and that don't know you, and that the reason that you can make so much money is that you don't want to know where the money is invested. And this word is used to talk about women who are outside of polite society. So they can be exploited, they can be used, but you don't have to feel bad about what happens with them. Now, maybe You go to certain places in certain neighborhoods, and you can say there are prostitutes living there. But in our world, so often what happens is that's the thing that happens on the internet, where people have a distance, and so they exploit. They take advantage. They don't care. Last year, the Barna Group did a survey about pornography. And they found that 49% of practicing Christians admitted to viewing pornography. And they found that 62% said that they thought that they could view pornography and feel comfortable with how much pornography they were viewing. That it wasn't that big of a deal. It was fine. And that the number between people who were Christians and who were not Christians was almost kind of a outlier in the data. But the numbers were super close to each other, both in the 60s, of this idea that it is not that big of a deal. Not that big of a deal to do what? To keep someone far away and exploit them and use them. And so Proverbs warns about this idea of this exploitative, manipulative way. But it also warns that these things can kind of be taken on and that they will corrupt you from the inside. So this word zar that's used to talk about the stranger in Proverbs is also outside of the book of Proverbs used to talk about when God's people went into the land and they started seeing how the other pagans in the land started worshiping, and they had strange offerings. And that word strange offering is the same word that's used for stranger in Proverbs. That there is this idea of people who are different than you that you kind of go to and you exploit and you use. Now, because we live in a world that is it's so kind of normal to be strangers, we have to say, well, then where is it that we have this same danger? But obviously, this danger can come up whenever we want to be anonymous. Whenever we think, I'm not going to be known by someone, I would rather be totally separate. I would rather be totally disengaged from those who know me. I'd rather keep one part of my life over here, and then I'm going to keep my friends and my family over here. That is a similar way of letting that danger in strangers kind of come into the modern life. And it's super destructive. And so the Father warns, do not associate with it. But it's not just for you, because we could say, well, see, those strangers, they are terrible people. And you know what's interesting? Nowhere in Proverbs does the author of Proverbs disparage those people. The author of Proverbs does not say, the stranger who tries to lend you your cloak is a terrible person, stay away from them. He says, it is unwise to do that. He says, if somebody tries to get a cloak from a stranger and they owe you money, then hold them to it. But there's never this outright saying of these people are terrible, those people over there, which is so interesting. That book that I talked about, the author, Professor Diamond, one of the things that he points out is that in ancient cultures, the way that people interacted with strangers was almost always in conflict. Because most often, if a stranger was coming into your area, they were part of like a scouting party. They were looking for new land to take from you. They had some sort of catastrophe where Now, maybe it was a flood, maybe it was a famine or something, but maybe it was just them as poor farmers. Maybe they just were not good contributors to their own society, and so they were just kind of moving on to a place where they weren't known. That happens in modern times. We get into a fight with one group of friends, we move somewhere else. We move to a totally different group of friends rather than apologizing. We do that all the time. Or, he says it was to, they were moving because they were actually outlaws. They were actually problematic and dangerous. That was the most likely reason that you would bump into a stranger in the ancient world. Now, in our world, again, you bump into strangers all the time. You pull up to a light and you look around, and there's a good chance that you do not. Now, I know we're in Delaware, so some of you who are from Delaware, there's a good chance that you see 3 cousins. But normally, you look around and you will see a bunch of strangers. You're standing in the grocery line and you see a bunch of strangers. That kind of all the time we're around people that we don't know. But in the ancient world, that was not the case. So if you saw a stranger, there's a good chance that they could be a danger to you. Which is why we have to grab that other word for stranger that the Bible uses. Ger. There was zar, and now there's ger. And in ger, it's a totally different shade of meaning. It is totally different, wildly different. So let's go to this passage, Deuteronomy. This kind of helps us set the stage. This is Deuteronomy 10. God says, here's what I expect of you people. This is like kind of core, baked in. What does God expect of his people? And this is where love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, mind, and your strength. He says, this is what I command of you, that you love me and that you follow me. And then he says, because I am a God who is impartial. Meaning, I don't pick and choose. I don't decide that if you have to pay a certain fee and then no, he says, and then he says this, he defends the cause of the fatherless and the widows, and he loves the foreign residing among him. And what does God do? God gives them food and clothing. And he says, and you are to love those who are foreigners, for you yourself were foreigners in Egypt. Okay, so now just remember, ancient world, what's the most likely reason that you would see a foreigner? Invasion. They were bad at their life where they were, or they are outlaws. That was the reason. And yet God, not on the edge of what he has to say to his people, but like staked right to the middle, says, I want you to care for people in this way. So much. It's so interesting, right, that you would say, okay, the fatherless, orphans, right? Anybody like kick orphans very often and just say like, no, probably not. A few of you gave me dirty looks, like, no, I wouldn't, like, obviously not. And anybody like really hate widows, just like, oh, those terrible widows. Okay, at least the deacons aren't doing it. The deacons are saying, Sam, that's terrible. You just know. We say those are classes of people that need care. Those are classes of people that need help. God then says, I'm going to put another group of people in here that need care and help and protection. And they're the foreigner. And he does that. And he actually sets this group so much that sometimes in the Bible, he will just talk about the poor. And sometimes he will say the fatherless, the widow, the foreigner or the sojourner, depending on your version of the Bible, the poor, and kind of talk about this as a big group. But that this is this deep understanding for God that his people should care for a group of folks that maybe everybody else says is potentially destructive or dangerous, not helpful. He says you should care for them. And so we say, like, does that word ger show up in Proverbs specifically? And it actually doesn't. It doesn't say sojourner anywhere. But we would be able to say, right, that if God has an instruction about how you care for a widow and how you care for the poor kind of generally, you would say, I'm pretty sure that I can't, if God says that I should care for the poor in this way, like, let's look at this. Whoever oppresses the poor show contempt for their maker, but whoever is kind to the needy honors God. Okay, so let me ask you, like, do you think that if we showed contempt for the widow, that it would apply in this passage? It probably would, right? You can say, yes, I think it would, Sam. What about the fatherless? It's not okay, okay, fine, we won't hate the widows, but those orphans, they're the worst. That's going to be the one clip of this sermon that ends up on YouTube. We'd say, no, that's ridiculous. But what about people who are not from here? Who are people, and I'm not just talking about like people who have moved, but people who are far from you. Racially, socioeconomically, that are far from you. Ethnically, that are far from you. That are so far from you that they seem odd and weird and different, and you would say, they are strangers to me. Well, you're free to hate those people, right? No. Whoever oppresses the poor shows contempt for their maker. Who made everyone? God. But whoever is kind to the needy honors God. The righteous cares about justice for the poor, but the wicked have no such concern. A different translation of it says, the righteous are knowledgeable. They are wise when it comes to justice for the poor. That you understand what the Bible says. If you want to be righteous in this passage, the way that you get there is to know and care about what the Bible cares about when it comes to the care of the poor. But the wicked have no such concern. Can you feel the tension there? And this doesn't just stop in Proverbs. In fact, if you go to the last book, I'll just keep twisting the screws. You go to the last book of the Old Testament. And God says to his people, this is after they've been exiled. This is after they've come back. And he says, I'm going to put you on trial. I'm going to arrest you and put you on trial. And they say, for what? And there are 4 charges held against them. And guess what they are? That they defraud the laborer, they defraud the poor of their wages, they oppress the widows and the fatherless, and they deprive the foreigners of justice. And God says that all of that relates to they do not fear the Lord. What's the whole book of Proverbs been about? Fearing the Lord. What's the beginning of wisdom? Fearing the Lord. And yet, when God holds his people accountable, he says, if you do not give care to the fatherless, to the widow, to the poor, to the worker, and to the foreigner, to the alien, to the illegal, then you do not fear the Lord. And we know that the whole point of Proverbs is to establish us in wisdom, to recognize that God is God and I am not God, and that he is the one that's in charge, and that I am not meant to tell God what my path should look like, but he is meant to establish my path so that I can walk in his good paths rather than establishing my own. And Proverbs laid out for us this wisdom. Now we have these two words for the poor. Zar, which is a warning, a danger, and ger, which is this wild, outlandish, seeming, maybe we would even say unwise generosity for people who have not earned it. And we have to, as Christians, hold both and hear both and obey both. It should matter to you when people are kept at arm's length because it is convenient that you get really cheap sneakers and you don't know where they come from. It should matter to you that people are economically exploited. It should matter to you that women are treated as other and used rather than honored. It should matter that there are people who come over, and this is part of that czar, they come over in a way that is outside of legal channels, and they are kept in such a way that they're easy to be exploited. They're kept as an underclass. It's really easy to pay somebody under the table when they don't have a Social Security card, and you threaten to call ICE on them if they don't show up and do their job for half the price that you could pay somebody else. Right? And everybody's excited about this sermon. I just want to say, you're all just like so psyched. And honestly, though, it should matter to us when the benefits of a system that have a whole bunch of people come over outside of legal channels then allows other people to come over through those same channels and scam or do other illegal things. That should matter. That's a part of this warning about the czar that he gives. This stranger danger. That's part of this. That's there. We should care about it. When other people come looking to scam or exploit, that should matter to Christians. But just as much, it should matter to us that God says he shows no partiality. In fact, God says that he establishes one law for the rich and for the poor alike. They're not two classes of laws. It's not that if you make over a certain amount of money, then you get to go to a certain corner. If you don't, you don't. God doesn't talk like that. In fact, there is one set of laws in the Bible for citizens and immigrants alike. That's what God says. And Jesus, he gets even more specific. Jesus tells us that if we are unwilling to help someone and actually bring a stranger close and love them and care for them, we're not just in danger of rejecting somebody that we don't know, we're in danger of rejecting Jesus himself. That's how serious caring for strangers is in the Bible. Now listen, I understand that for like the last 14 minutes, everybody's ear has been tilted listening for like through this sort of political filter. And every single one of you in this room, or I hope not every single one of you, but many, many, many of you were hearing certain things and you were saying yes, yes, no, yes, yes, no, based on how you voted. Red and blue. You know what's crazy about that? That word czar is used to talk about getting into bed and ending up ungodly, of marrying together God's holy instruction with pagan idolatry. That's what God warns us about, that we hold these two things together. And so I understand that almost everybody in this room hasn't liked part of what I've said. I love you. I am not sorry. And the moment that we're living in, we are told that Jesus is supposed to be the wingman. And he will not be. If we are to follow Christ, we do not get to pick and choose how we follow Christ, when we follow Christ, and what he says. Our call is to submit to him. Our call is to say, Jesus, I will listen to everything you have to say. And there are going to be some things that are easy for me to do, and there are going to be some things that are really hard for me to do, Lord. But Jesus, I will submit to you in all things. So what does that actually look like for the stranger? You know, there's this beautiful, wild story. I probably say that about every story of Jesus because they're just so. If you are not, if you don't have a Bible and you're not in the Bible regularly, you can get an app and you can download the Bible, you can listen to it, you can read it. I was really struggling to read the Bible last year, and my wife said, your eyes are kind of getting old, Sam, and I got a new Bible with a larger font, and all of a sudden I fell back in love with the Word of God. We have Bibles for you. Like, there are gift Bibles out there that you can take. But seriously, whatever you're going through, probably the best thing for you would be to say, I wonder what Jesus does with this. How does he interact with this? And so we have these two strangers, right? We have this dangerous stranger, and we have this protected stranger. And there's this story in the New Testament in Luke, I think it's Luke 7, where Jesus is eating at the home of this Pharisee. This Pharisee's named Simon. It's not the same Simon as Simon, the disciple. And this woman comes, and it says this woman is a notorious sinner. That's code for this woman is that first kind of stranger. She's a czar. She's a prostitute. This woman is outside of polite society. You say, maybe she did it to herself. Maybe she was put there. But she is outside of polite society. And this woman comes with a gift for Jesus. And Simon, he says, this man can't obviously be a prophet, because if he was a prophet, if this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is. She takes this jar of perfume and she pours it out over Jesus, and she's weeping, and she washes his feet with her tears and perfume, and she lets down her hair and she washes his feet with her hair. And this Pharisee says, see, he's not saying ceremonially pure. She's the stranger danger, and he doesn't realize it. And what Jesus says is, you welcomed me in, and you didn't wash my feet. You just kind of accepted me here, but you didn't. And then he asks a story, and he says, if someone owed like $1 billion, and someone owed $50, and the person who owed more money than they could ever pay back went to that person and said, I'm sorry, I can never pay you back. And the person said, it is forgiven. It's over. He says, would that be a big deal for them? He said, yeah. And he says, those who have more to be forgiven have more to celebrate. So he has this woman who is this dangerous stranger. But he then moves her into this category of this prospective stranger. But he doesn't keep her there. He says to her, your sins are forgiven. See, the reason that God wanted to warn the people, he said, look, I don't want you to become like everybody else, but I want you to be so wonderful, so inviting, so generous that people want to be a part of you. There's a whole set of laws that God has for how if the Egyptians come and they want to be a part of you, for how all these other people come and they want to be a part of you. And in the Old Testament, over and over and over again, there's this image and the promise and the hope that one day every nation would show up knocking on the door of Israel. Every alien and stranger and foreigner of every complexion, every language, every clothing style, and they would say, we want to be here because you have God. And God would say, welcome. I've been waiting for you. And that whole thing is flipped in the New Testament. So that instead of all the strangers coming and knocking on the doors of Jerusalem, God sets his people out to move people from being strangers to neighbors, to friends, to family. And Jesus isn't contaminated by this woman's sin, and he isn't contaminated by your sin. But if we're honest about the things that we've done with our life, all of us are closer to the dangerous stranger in the way that our hearts work than that pure and righteous person. And Jesus knew that about you. And he offered forgiveness to you the same way that he offers forgiveness to this woman. There's a church plant in our denomination up in Milwaukee, and it has the absolutely wildest name. The name of the church is Friends of Sinners. And Jesus is not ashamed to call sinners friends. So we live in a world where it is easy to have lots of people that we bump into that are strangers. And to keep them at a distance for economic benefits, for lustful benefits, because politics tell us we should live in a certain way or think in a certain way. And yet what God calls us to is to see people move from strangers to family. That's what the church is supposed to be about. So we don't all have to go to Jerusalem anymore. No. Instead, he sends us here. He calls us to engage with those around us. We live in absolutely wild times. And yet, in God's wisdom, we can hold courage and compassion together. We can love the Lord and pursue him and want what's best for people. Not because we're better, not because we pretend, but because we know how good Jesus is. And this whole time we've been, and it's a long sermon, I know. Charlie's not here to tell me to wrap it up, so you guys are stuck. There's this whole reality in Proverbs that there is a better way to live. And for so many of us, we have this anxiety that rattles around in our heart. And God offers us peace. He offers us a better way. But it is not a piecemeal solution. You don't get to say, Jesus, I love this plan. I want to take parts 1, 4, 6, and 9 and leave the rest on the side. He offers you a life, and he invites you into a life. It's a life that Paul says means that we feel sometimes like we're the aliens, like we're the strangers, that our citizenship is in the kingdom of heaven. But it makes us feel like the weirdos and the standouts, which is fine because Jesus loved those kinds of people and he loves us. And we get to live a different way as a gift from him. And it's going to look different. Let's pray together.